Thank you, Hannah and Matt. I'm John Anagnost. I'm in the Planning and Development Department at the City of Raleigh. And this evening we have staff from Planning and Development as well as Transportation. And so the folks that will be delivering the presentation are myself and then Hannah Reckow and then Jason Myers in the Department of Transportation. Next slide, please. And so we'll go through, obviously the two different topics of this meeting are about the Transit Overlay District mapping process and then a separate process about a concept called busway streets. So we'll talk about both of those and then we'll take your questions. Next slide, please. So the first topic is the Transit Overlay District. And so that is a part of the city zoning code that has been in development for some time. And so we'll go into the background of how that actually came about. And so the start of that story is bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit is a special type of transit service that uses buses with rubber tires that run on a regular roadway. So it's not a train, doesn't have a track, but basically it's a very high quality bus service. And so you can see some of the features listed here on this slide. I won't read them off for you, but basically it's very reliable, it's comfortable, and it's quick. And so what that does is it allows people, particularly people who might not be able to afford a vehicle, to have, as you can see, have access to opportunity. And then the other thing is that the actual development around the bus rapid transit stations can create special places within the city that can then grow in their own right. And so we'll see more about that with the TOD overlay. Next slide, please. So that's the start of the story, is that the county and the city, Wake County and the city of Raleigh, have created a plan for this bus rapid transit service. And that is the Wake County Transit Plan that was adopted in 2016. And then that same year, there was a special sales tax that was adopted by referendum or approved by referendum of voters to fund this plan. And so since then, the city and the county have been working together to design the actual bus rapid transit routes and then to plan the development in the areas around bus rapid transit. So this timeline shows you some of those different aspects of planning, mostly led by the city, but with coordination with Go Triangle, the county transit agency, to develop these planning goals. And so you can see here, the city council authorized this transit overlay district modification that we'll talk about. And then while that's going on, we have the design processes for New Bern Avenue BRT, Western BRT, and then Southern BRT. Next slide, please. So when we were thinking about the aspects of BRT, there's basically two different elements that are involved. The actual design of the roadway itself to accommodate the bus service. That's largely an engineering process, although it does have public input. And then there's another part that's about what are our goals for development and the future of how people live their lives around the bus rapid transit service. And so that's where about 3 years ago, the city had this process called Equitable Development Around Transit to really think through comprehensively, not just for one particular bus rapid transit corridor, but for all the bus rapid transit corridors. What are our goals? What are our strategies for how we want to grow and use that service? And so one of the big things that came out of that process was that the people of Raleigh said that we want to grow around the transit service. We don't want to keep spreading out farther and farther with roadways where you have to drive to get around. Next slide, please. And so based on that input, and there was many other aspects of that EDAT process, Equitable Development Around Transit, and all those things were put into this guidebook called the Equitable Transit Oriented Development Guidebook. And that was adopted by the City Council last year. Excuse me. And basically laid out the strategy that then we can carry forward to the other planning processes around the different BRT corridors. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what is in that book, but one of the key things that's in there is that the transit overlay district should be applied on all of the bus rapid transit corridors to enable development that is supportive of transit ridership, and that also creates active locations around the transit service where people can go for employment and shopping and other things and housing. Next slide, please. And so the transit overlay district was authorized, as I mentioned, by City Council, and then it was drafted by staff. That went through its own public process that included meetings like this one, and it was approved earlier this year. And so that is a modification of an existing transit overlay district. The previous version of this was intended for use with light rail that was planned in the past in Raleigh and other areas in the Triangle region. Raleigh at around 3 to 4, basically once we started planning bus rapid transit, kind of gave up on the light rail strategy. And so what we did with the transit overlay district modification TC17A20 was to reorient the regulations in this overlay district to focus on bus rapid transit. And so what does that mean? So the goals that we started with came from that equitable transit oriented development guidebook and that equitable development around transit process. And so the goals are more housing and diverse housing that's appropriate for different income levels, walkable streets that are connected and that have a safe and comfortable place for a pedestrian to get to and from the transit service. And then that all modes of transportation have the ability to function in the surrounding area. So not just, well, you drive to a parking lot and you get on the bus, that you can really have a choice of transportation. Next slide, please. And so these are some examples of the type of development in other cities that are kind of a model for how transit-oriented development can work in Raleigh. And so this is actually, closer into downtown, we already see a lot of development like this. And so basically it's saying, let's, try to match development that's appropriate to the existing scale through this TOD overlay to the areas around the transit service. Next slide, please. And so this is another aspect from the Equitable Transit-Oriented Development Guidebook that you saw a couple slides ago. And this is, again, illustrating what are the goals? What kind of development is going to be supportive of using transit? And so the top image is, a typical shopping center that you might see today, particularly, say, on New Bern Avenue outside of 440, or on South Saunders going towards Garner, where you have a single-story retail center and then a large parking lot. And so if someone got out off a bus along the street, they're going to have to walk through that large parking lot. They don't have a sidewalk. They're walking between cars. And there's really only one destination, that big box store. And so what Equitable Transit-Oriented Development says is, let's change that whole way of thinking about a built environment. So when you get off a bus, you're going to have a comfortable place to walk. You're going to have a mix of destinations, including potentially housing and employment, including potentially higher skilled employment in offices. But that can still make use of the existing development pattern. So it doesn't necessarily mean wiping a clean slate for redevelopment. This type of development can be mixed in with what's already there, and TOD addresses that. And so another example, similar situation where a building is set pretty far back from the street. And so what are the ways that a public space can, again, bring activity, bring life to an area so that when someone gets off a bus or is going to the bus, they have things that are keeping their attention and destinations to go to. Next slide, please. All right, so that all sounds very nice, but what does that mean when it comes to actual zoning regulations? Because it is, obviously it's much easier to draw a conceptual picture than it is to have development actually fulfill that in the real world. So the way that we approach that through the Transit Overlay District is through this set of regulations. And I'm not going to read all of these, but it is a lot of things that are regulated. And for some of them, it's in a different way than in most other parts of the city. And we'll go into a little bit of that detail right now. So next slide, please. So the first thing is there are some uses that are prohibited in the Transit Overlay District. And the purpose of that is that some uses are largely meant to be accessed by a vehicle or serve people in vehicles. Drive-through restaurant, obviously, not only is the drive-through serving people in a vehicle, but I'll just go into this quick example. When you look at the layout of a drive-through business, the building is in the middle of vehicle lanes that go all the way around the building. So no matter which direction you're coming from, to get to a drive-through restaurant, you have to walk across the path of vehicles. So it's clearly indicating that the car is the priority in that space and not a human being. And there's many other uses that are either have that aspect or are just oriented towards cars or highways. And so those are prohibited. The other thing you see here that's prohibited is single family and duplex housing. So that means new development. So if somebody had a lot and they said, I want to build new housing, they would not be able to build those things. If you have an existing single family or duplex and you want to modify it, you want to rebuild it if it's damaged, those things are allowed by the TOD. It's really just saying new development. And the other thing is we are not intending to map the TOD on many places that have those types of housing, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Next slide, please. All right, so another key feature of the TOD is that a property owner or developer could have additional height if they include affordable housing units, or if the building is completely dedicated to employment uses or non-residential uses. And so here you can see the ratios there. Basically, the way it works is if you get a 50% height bonus, and that rounds up to the nearest story, if you include affordable units in development. And those have to be affordable for 30 years, and they have to be affordable for people earning 60% of the area median income. And so just to give an example, if you have a 3-story zoning, that would allow you to build up to 5 stories. But with that extra space, you have to include those affordable units. Next slide, please. The next thing that we'll touch on with the TOD is a minimum building height of 2 stories. And again, this is applying to new development. So if you have an existing building, an existing retail shop or shopping center, you can continue to maintain that, continue to operate that. It's really if you were going to tear that down and rebuild it, you had a new site, you're going to build something new, then you're going to have to build 2 stories or more. And then another thing to note is if the TOD is mapped on a residential district, it would allow the development in that area to match the residential mixed use dimensional standards and building types rather than whatever the residential district is there to begin with. So as an example, residential 6 has a maximum density of around 7 to 10 units per acre. What this would do is say that can go up to 3 stories in height and you have apartment buildings and be built out as a mixed use district. Next slide, please. All right, so that is the summary of the overlay district. We do have more information if we get specific questions, but those are kind of the highlights. Now we can move to the mapping process, and Hannah's going to take it from you.
Great. Thanks. So talked through what the TOD is, and now the city has this new or updated zoning district, but it doesn't really affect real development or urban form until it is added to the zoning map. And so like any other request to change the zoning, a rezoning request is required to do that. The city council authorized the city to pursue this rezoning request last month in October. And specifically what the request will be is to add the TOD overlay to areas along 2 of the bus rapid transit corridors. The Western Corridor, which goes from downtown along Western Boulevard to Cary, and the Southern Corridor, which follows South Wilmington Street south towards Garner. And so you can see the areas in purple are the properties that will be included in this request. This is a pretty zoomed out map. So in a little bit, I'm going to show you how to view a more interactive map that you can look at a little closer on your own computer. But first, I wanted to walk through why these areas are chosen. As you can see along these corridors, some are included and some are left out. And so the kind of guiding principles this request is starting from is looking at areas that are within walking distance of the BRT routes. So in that case, this is a 1/4 mile from the route itself. And then within those areas, the properties that are already able to redevelop in a transit supportive way or are more likely to develop with that type of mixed use development. And so out of these goals, we have a few criteria to sort of determine whether or not a property will be included or not in the request. And I'm going to walk through each of those. So the first is properties that can already develop with mixed use development. So that's areas that have one of the mixed use zoning districts as their underlying zoning or heavy industrial. And so these are areas that are likely to respond to this new transit service, are well suited already to produce mixed use development and meet the goals of the TOD. There's a lot of areas actually along both of these corridors that meet this criteria, but one example is along the southern corridor along South Wilmington Street near Beacon Road and Rush Street. These are properties that currently have mixed use zoning underlying and are within that quarter-mile buffer, and so they'll be included in this rezoning request. A second criteria are properties that are right next to the future BRT corridor. And this includes properties that have residential zoning. So these are, because of their proximity to the future BRT service, are going to have, what develops on them is going to have a pretty big impact on the development and built form around transit. And when we're looking at properties that fall under this that have residential zoning, we're looking for the ones that are more impactful, so are larger in size. So if they were less than half an acre in size, they will not be included in this request. And so this is an example of along Western Boulevard near the intersection with Gannett Street. These little properties I have highlighted have residential zoning, but they're larger in size and right next to the future BRT corridor, so that they will be included in the request for that reason. So the next criteria we looked at were areas that may not currently have zoning that allows mixed use development, but where there is policy support for that, where they're designated for that on the future land use map. The future land use map is a policy map that the city has for the whole city. It's a long range land use planning for the city that designates the type of development that is appropriate in the future. And so, these are areas where there is a long-range plan to accommodate growth and likely to be redevelopment here. An example of this is also along Western, farther west, north of Western Boulevard near Bashford Road. These properties are larger in size and don't currently have mixed use development, but are designated for more intensive development on the future land use map. And I'll note here again, we're looking at properties that are larger in size. So if it was less than an acre in size, it's not included in the request. And then another criteria is a property that has more intensive residential zoning. So that's an R10 district and is currently developed with an apartment complex. So again, we're taking a longer term view here. These types of properties are unlikely to redevelop at a lower density than they currently have. And so we're more likely to have a type of mixed use or transit supportive development. An example is along Western Boulevard near Buck Jones Road. This collection of properties is an example within the quarter-mile buffer. It has R10 zoning and either has an apartment complex on it or is in common ownership with that apartment complex. And then the last criteria is just undeveloped properties that are owned by the city and are in a park or greenway. The city wants to take advantage of the benefits of the TOD district and support its goals. And so these properties are also included. And a little example also along Western Boulevard is this property here near the future realignment. So if a property fell under one of those categories, most likely included in the request, but there are some circumstances that make a property not well suited to the TOD, and I've listed them here. They're, if the property is a cemetery or a school, if it's owned by the state, if it's a rail line, or if it's in an area where the walkable access is cut off, such as by rail line, or areas that have some sort of historical designation or zoning, or one of a few of the city's zoning districts, conservation management, typically undeveloped, planned developments are take a little more focus to write and are more custom to the site, and then downtown mixed use is the zoning district for downtown. So even if an area did fall under one of the criteria I went through previously, if it's one of these, it will not be included in this request. So as I mentioned, we do have a map that you can look at if you want to take a closer look at this boundary. It's an online viewer, you can interact with it. And I'm even going to stop sharing the slides for a second and just show you how to access that on the city's website. On your own. I will share. You open up a browser and go to the city's website, raleighnc.gov. Click on the search bar and type in TOD mapping. That'll give you several hits. The first one, Transit Overlay District Mapping, is the main page for this process. It'll be updated throughout the process. There'll be information about where we are, and how you can participate. If you scroll down to a section titled Project Intent, there is a link here to a TOD mapping viewer. That's the image we showed. Clicking on it will ask you if you want to go to a new site. That opens a map that looks like this. You can see the image you saw before. You can see the legend. The purple areas are the proposed district boundary. And so you can zoom in and click on properties. You can also search for property if you want to know if a particular property is included or not. And so just to pull a random example, you can type in an address and it'll bring you to that address, and you can see it's in purple. And the viewer will also show you the reason for inclusion. And this is referencing the criteria I just went through. All right, so next I wanted to walk through what you can expect moving forward. As I mentioned, the TOD will be can only be applied through a rezoning request. And so the applicant, in this case, is the city, but it will go through all the typical steps that other rezoning requests go through. This is a diagram that shows the overall process. At each step, there is at least one opportunity for public engagement. So it starts with a first neighborhood meeting, and at this point, there's no application that's formally filed yet, but we would hold a neighborhood meeting, kind of like this one, with surrounding neighbors to discuss the request. From there, fill out an application, file it, have staff review it and make sure everything is complete. And then we'll hold another neighborhood meeting, second neighborhood meeting. So that's the second opportunity for engagement. And then from there, the request would be discussed by the Planning Commission. And this is an advisory body to the City Council. They review planning matters related to planning. And they hold at least one public meeting to discuss the request. And that's a public meeting that anyone can attend, listen to, or speak at. And what the Planning Commission is doing is working towards recommending either approval or denial of the rezoning request to City Council. City Council eventually receives that recommendation, and then they set up their own public meeting, their own public hearing, which again is another opportunity for anyone to participate and speak. And then they work towards the final action of either approval or denial of the request. And so, as I mentioned, there's opportunities throughout. I'll just highlight them again. You can participate in either of the neighborhood meetings. There's also an online engagement portal that the city has for rezoning requests. That is a place where you can read some more information about the request and then leave your questions and comments. And staff is keeping an eye on that and will be available to answer questions. And then all of the comments we get in that portal get transmitted to the Planning Commission and to City Council, so they have those for their review. And then you can also participate in a Planning Commission or City Council meeting. At these points, those are likely to be virtual, like this one. So you could watch it live or watch it after the fact, or sign up to speak if you wanted to. And then lastly, a few other ways to stay in touch. All of those public meetings that I just mentioned are advertised by mail to the properties that they seek to rezone and to properties in the surrounding area. And then signs are also posted along the corridor. You may have already seen some that advertise this meeting. Those will be updated with new meeting dates when appropriate. And then on the project website that I just showed, there's a way to sign up for updates. You can give your email address, and then you just receive updates like notifications about this meetings like this. And then I have an email address here and a phone address here. You're welcome to reach out with any questions you have. And then at the end also, I'll show all of our contact information as well if you wanted to reach out directly. So those are the main ways to participate in this process and stay in touch. And I think that's the conclusion of the portion focused on the TOD mapping project. I'll hand it off to Jason Myers now, who will talk through the other topic, the busway street section.
Thank you, Hannah. My name is Jason Myers. I'm a transportation planner in the city's Department of Transportation. My colleague, Het Patel, who works in our transit division, is also a part of the meeting. Het is responsible for some of the planning and overseeing the design and implementation of bus rapid transit in the south and the west corridors. But there's a couple different pieces to this that are kind of going along with the TOD mapping that Hannah and John talked about, and that is more of the transportation comp plan elements and the designation of the streets for busways and for BRT. Hannah, can you hit the next slide, please? So one of the main maps of our comprehensive plan is map T1. It's in the transportation chapter, and that is the street plan, and that shows major streets and collector streets throughout the city. It helps set the framework of our street network in a higher level sense. It doesn't have many local streets or smaller streets. Certainly does not have most neighborhood streets and single family neighborhoods and and industrial streets and industrial parks and things like that. But it helps set a framework that helps shape the connectivity and the access and the network as property develops. And in places where there is some amount of previous development, and that pattern has been set over the decades, but there is presumed to be a lot of change in the development going forward, we often use a street plan to help shape that and help make sure that adjacent properties develop in a way that speaks appropriately to each other and doesn't put one development at a disadvantage relative or an advantage relative to the other in terms of helping to build out the city's network. It's something that through some of our area planning efforts we dig into a lot. on the Western Boulevard corridor, which is in front of Planning Commission right now, and the Capitol Boulevard corridor north of 440 are two places where we're making changes to the street plan. But the implementation of BRT necessitates some changes to the street plan as well. Putting bus rapid transit lanes and stations and other infrastructure inside of our streets requires a different cross section than what we had been planning for before this. So there's actually two parts to this next section. There's a text change to our Unified Development Ordinance. That case is about to go, or is just went on to the text change portal, and that will insert new street standards for 3 different kinds of streets, which I'll talk about in the next slides, that have busway components to them. That's one case. The other part of it is a comprehensive plan amendment to apply those street standards as the bus rapid transit planning has worked through the very preliminary designs of the southern, the western, and the more advanced design of the eastern corridor. At this point, we are not planning to apply a busway section to the north corridor, which is also an important part of the Wake Transit Plan, because there's some more advanced planning that needs to happen there in order to decide where that's applied. And that is a major investment study that's about to kick off too. So a couple quick things about how the street plan is implemented. Generally, it's implemented through development, and that there's a dedication of right-of-way and a construction of a development's half of the street if it's along the front of a street. And if a street plan goes through a large tract that's being developed, they build that street as a part of their development. But there's a lot of flexibility in that, usually in the network. And that those regulations are in the Unified Development Ordinance and the Raleigh and the Street Design Manual. Next slide, Hannah, and I'll get into specifically how these are put together and what they are. So there are 3 different sections. We're calling them busway 2-lane, busway 4-lane, and busway 6-lane. And so these are the 2, 4, and 6 lanes are how many lanes of general purpose traffic there are in that street section. And what's common for all of them is a central median that has 24 foot of pavement for the median transit for the buses to operate on, and curb and gutter to help deal with the drainage there. And then medians on either side of that, which can be landscaping, but also are important to be able to put in the stops themselves and the platforms and the bike racks and any other amenities that belong in that median transit station area. And the combination of those 2 spaces is roughly about 40 feet of additional width for the right of way. Now, most of the places we're applying this, we're taking out of lane of traffic that was in the street plan before. So a lot of places, the comprehensive plan amendment for where right now we've got a 4-lane divided plan with 4 lanes of traffic in the median, what we're doing is taking away 2 lanes of general purpose traffic and putting in a busway. But the cross section does get wider because of the need for the station infrastructure in that median. And also because we're trying to narrow our lanes in Raleigh to the extent that's safe, and that often works pretty well. 11 and 10-foot lanes can be safer in many cases, but to operate large articulated buses at high speed reliably requires a little bit wider lane for a transit way. And so in all 3 cases, we have 12-foot lane spec for those. One of the things that many folks will notice is the behind the curb roadside area that it's marked as 21.5 feet on this slide. It's the same in all 3 sections, is a little bit different than what you generally see on the streets now. The city of Raleigh passed a text change back in October to modify all of our avenue streets to have this design behind the curb. So our 2-lane divided, our 4-lane divided, and our 6-lane divided streets have the design that you're seeing here already a part of their standard, but that's a recent change to the city standards. It puts the bikeway a short buffer away from the traffic behind the curb, but also separated from pedestrians so that people with strollers and wheelchairs are able to be, and people who have mobility or vision impairments are able to walk safely on a sidewalk without somebody on a bike putting them at risk, nor those folks slowing down people on bikes. And when we were going through the text change process to amend those street sections, one of the things I told people about was that their design vehicle for a cyclist is an e-bike going 20 miles an hour, maybe a grandma on an e-bike going 20 miles an hour, or somebody on a scooter going about that fast. They're different than cars, but they're also different than pedestrians. So that 21.5 foot is the same as what was just adopted behind the curb. And we've got in the 2-lane here, 11-foot travel lanes that helps make sure that if there's a breakdown or a fender bender or a need to fix a pothole or something, we can kind of manage traffic around that. And Hannah, if you can go to the next slide, we'll look at the 4-lane where we add in a lane of traffic. Everything else stays the same, except now given 2 lanes side by side, we don't need a little bit of extra space there to deal with those instances. So we are specing 10-foot lanes in both of those. And then 6-lane divided in the next slide is the exact same thing with just an additional couple lanes. And so the comp plan amendment application has been submitted. That is also staff initiated. I'm told it is going to be CP 1421, and that will apply those 3 sections to pieces of the bus rapid transit corridor as defined through the early stages of design there. And there is a text change that is going live that's TC 421 to add these 3 sections to the Unified Development Ordinance and the Street Design Manual. And I will kick it back over to Hannah and my planning colleagues to kind of moderate comments and questions, and I can help answer those, whether it's about this or other things. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jason. So yeah, like you mentioned, that is the end of our sort of intro presentation. You can stop sharing